Ruthless Compassion is a podcast about how you can turn your emotional shit into fertilizer for success and see your darkest moments as opportunities to transform into a powerful kindness warrior. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave a review wherever you listen. This is Dr. Marcia Sirota with the Ruthless Compassion podcast, and I'm here today with Jason Anderson, a film critic and programmer, and we're going to talk movies today. Welcome to the podcast, Jason.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's such a pleasure. This is so much fun because we're sort of doing a little something different, talking about the intersection between psychiatry, mental health, and media. And today we're going to talk about the film The Fabelmans, which we've both seen. And before we start, I thought maybe you could just say a little bit about who you are and what you do, and then just launch into your dissection of the film.
That was great. Thanks so much. And yeah, my name is Jason Anderson, and I've been a film critic for many years and film journalist for places like iWeekly and The Grid in Toronto. I wrote for those for a long time, places like The Globe and The Star, and currently I write for a couple of magazines, including Broadview and Cinema Scope and Sight and Sound. But a lot of my practice now is about film programming, which I do for festivals like the Toronto International Film Festival, for whom I do short films. Also Kingston Canadian Film Festival, which is coming up in March, and Aspen Shortsfest, which is in April. So I see a lot of movies. I mean, I kind of always have seen a lot of movies as a film critic, and now I see a lot, maybe even more as a programmer. So, but it's a great gig. I mean, I certainly love movies, and I think that any opportunity to sort of get into them, and I think my interest is always just finding what's interesting movies, and then whether or not I like them particularly fit with my taste. I think there's plenty of movies that I've really appreciated over the years that were, even if they were deeply flawed. And as for The Fabelmans, I think it's actually a very strong film, and I think it's one that was a very significant film over the last few months, and had a big impact at TIFF in Toronto when it played in September. And I think it's, I mean, obviously it's a big deal because it's by Steven Spielberg, who was probably the preeminent blockbuster director of the last 40, 50 years. And it's an unusual film for him because it is so deeply personal. And he's described the film as semi-autobiographical, but it's actually probably more accurate than many biopics or historical dramas actually are in terms of how they correspond with the facts of someone's life. I mean, he has changed details, and it's not about the Spielbergs, it's about a fictional family called the Fabelmans, but it otherwise quite closely mirrors aspects of Spielberg's early life, growing up first in New Jersey and then in Arizona and California. And this it's very much a reflection on, not just his kind of original immersion into art and creativity as a filmmaker, as this sort of budding director who makes westerns with his fellow Boy Scouts and things like that, and really, I mean, it's amazing because it even sort of starts with, the film starts with this sort of originating incident of his life, which is going with his parents to see The Greatest Show on Earth, and being, I think, profoundly disturbed by a train crash in the film, which is totally pretty much straight from Spielberg's own life. Like, it was something that really affected him as a kid. I think it's such a fascinating script. I mean, just in terms of the film as writers, it's Spielberg writing with Tony Kushner, who is one of the greatest writers alive by any standard as the author of. This is a very rich piece, and you sort of see how they kind of have quite clear intentions throughout the film about what they're trying to portray, and certainly starting with this moment of Spielberg as a young boy being kind of just freaked out by this thing he sees on screen, and then replicating it, kind of creating his own version of it, and in a way of kind of interesting commentary on what art is to people, what artistic expression, how that is something that artists do in order to sort of maybe exert a sense of control over things in their lives or memories or their experiences that are affecting them deeply, and that they assert a mastery over it. And the film's quite clear about that, just in terms of what movie making means to Spielberg, or the sort of young Spielberg alter ego is a means of kind of exacting control over his life. And and that continues throughout the film. It's certainly one theme of the film, but there are many other themes of the film too. But that's as a sort of preamble. Certainly, it's kind of this the familiar. What's the term I love? The Bildungsroman, where you kind of have these sort of experiences and incidents in terms of how a young person is developing. And this one does take this sort of boy Fabelman from quite young to sort of the brink of adulthood. But a lot of it's about art, and a lot of it's about family. And I think it gets at a lot of very kind of core things. And I think it's and like I said, an unusual film in that it's a, kind of reflection on this major artist, and man who's had a major impact on cinema and culture more widely for decades. For him to kind of look back on this part of his life and take stock and really delve into it in a way which is, I think, pretty significant and pretty courageous.
It's interesting, you're talking about his, initiation, which was this awful scene of this train crash, and how he, got a train set and then he recreated it on film over and over again. And, they even said out loud in the film, he has anxiety,
Right.
And so this was his way to manage his anxiety. And, I'm a writer too. I write screenplays, I write novels, and somebody asked me, why do you write? And I said, because I get to play God. I get to create a universe that I can control, and I can move all the characters around, and I have power. It's the only place I actually have power in my life, and I have control in my life. I can create the world, and it follows my rules, right? And it's such a funny thing, because I see little Steven, played by little Sammy, doing exactly the same thing.
It's amazing. And that idea, I think, is really kind of, it's certainly something that will pop up, or, artists and writers will talk about at times, but it's been a really surprising, kind of incarnations of that idea. When I think one person who sort of talked a lot about that in recent years is Bruce Springsteen, and about sort of Bruce Springsteen's, his sort of early experiences with family and the sort of dynamics that kind of made him feel very uncontrolled and insecure. And I mean, I think actually you could probably do a Springsteen Fabelmans, and it's probably quite similar, maybe sort of the Italian Catholic as opposed to the Jewish American version of this story. It was certainly sort of complex relationship with his parents. And Springsteen talks a lot about how, he does these, for decades, he's done these sort of epic long concerts, and is this sort of incredibly charismatic and garrulous, this amazing showman. But he's talked about how that's the only time of his day he's like that, and the rest of it he feels like that. To think about people who are performers or going on stage or making art, that is a way of kind of being controlled or being something for themselves that they are unable to at other times of the day. So that's why maybe he wants to be on stage for 3 or 4 hours, because it's when he feels good that day.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It's I think they got that right in the film, right? They got that piece very correct.
Very much. And I think it's great. I think it's certainly something I'm always, it definitely is, just in terms of what it's sort of saying about, choosing living a creative life, or choosing art, that's a theme that kind of very much comes to the fore, both in regards to Sammy in relationship with his mother, Mitzi, who's played by Michelle Williams, but also this uncle who sort of shows up in the middle of the movie, played by Judd Hirsch, who
I wanted to ask you about that, because that's such a pivotal scene, right?
And he says it quite outright. And, I think some people have sort of criticized the script because it's kind of like, it's one of those scripts where it doesn't actually, there's not a lot of subtext, because a lot of what the film actually has to say about these things is straight up text. People say these things point blank. And certainly in that scene, he says point blank to Sammy, like, well, we're artists, we're creatives, and we, that's going to put you in conflict with family and with other relationships, because you are going to choose your art over people a lot of the time, and you're going to sort of sacrifice relationships in order to sort of fulfill yourself. And that is, as the Judd Hirsch uncle notes, it can be a curse. It's not necessarily, I think a lot of films will sort of valorize that, but there is a cost to living like that, to being committed to creative life, and that they may come at the expense of other parts of your life. And that's something that is quite clear in the Fabelmans. And in regards to Mitzi, who's played by Michelle Williams, Mitzi it's definitely emphasized that she was, kind of, not sure she had been a concert pianist. I think they very much, she had devoted her life to becoming a concert pianist this is the real Spielberg's mother, to becoming a concert pianist, and had put that aside in order to become a mother and homemaker. And Spielberg's father is an electrical engineer. And so there is this sort of frustrated creative, this sort of abandoned creativity that haunts Mitzi. And one of the themes is her kind of tentative sort of return to the piano, but that she is this artist, and an artist who was unable to live a creative life because of other choices or expectations. And that is something that I think is the film suggests quite clearly is a source of her sorrow and sort of the depression issues that she fights, is that she was going down a life path that was maybe against her nature, against what she wanted. So
Yeah, it also makes me wonder, because there was a scene toward the end where Sam's younger sister comes to talk to him right after the parents have announced that they're divorcing, and she says to him, it must have been really hard for mom living with this, man who was a genius and never feeling like she was as smart as him and as good as him. And I was just thinking how, as a thwarted artist, that was bad enough, but to be with a thwarted artist who was living with a man who was fulfilling all his dreams was,
yeah.
Very hard. And Benny was much more of a regular guy and not going to rub in her face her own failures or her own lack of courage to pursue her dreams, right?
Yeah, and that's true. Like, I mean, certainly we kind of like that from it's hard to live with people. I mean, there's certainly a challenge when in terms of in a partnership. It's kind of like, who gets to fulfill what they want, because it's very hard for both of those things to happen, or at least happen at the same time. And I think that's something that becomes a tension here, because as you said, Benny, which is a character played by Seth Rogen, who's close to the family, and a close friend of Sammy's father, becomes clear that there is more going on, at least an emotional affair between Mitzi and him, and that what kind of version of herself is possible with Benny versus what's possible with Sammy's father becomes starker as the film goes on. And it's really, and I think one of the kind of painful and authentic things about the film is it doesn't villainize anybody. It doesn't really. And in fact, Spielberg's talked about that, about how he kind of blamed his father and resented his father because his parents really did break up, and divorce around the same time as Sammy's parents do in the film. But he realized that, like, I think some things like in the film, his father was giving a particular version of events to the kids in order to protect his mother, and that's something that I think that Spielberg took a long time to understand. That basically his mother did leave his father for another man, but that his father wanted to protect his mother. He didn't want that was the sort of sacrifice the father made in order to sort of protect the kids. But obviously, it's these are those are when your parents break up, it's there's a lot of fallout and for children, and a lot of blame and a lot of misunderstanding. So I think that's certainly something that colors the film as well.
So I wanted to ask you about two parts of the film, which I thought were very important. So the one part of the film is when Sammy is, forced by his father basically to edit this footage of their camping trip, because his mother is very upset because her mother has died. Sammy's grandmother has passed away. So in order to cheer her up, Bert wants Sammy to make a little film of their camping trip because she was happy there. But when Sammy edits the film, he sees things that he wasn't supposed to see. And then there's a whole scene with mom. So why don't you talk about that?
Well, I mean, certainly there's this certainly a couple things going on. I mean, there's this sort of thing that I think many creative people, artistic people, have that sort of pressure where it's like, do this thing because maybe the hope that the artist has or somebody else has that you're going to provoke a particular reaction, make someone feel better or whatever. Like, you kind of just show them and do this home movie or what have you to kind of cheer somebody up or what. But I mean, what's interesting in that to me is that really what happens is that he sees his mother, like, in a way, like, and he hadn't expected. It's very painful to him to see his parents, see his mother, because I think that's something we don't, we, all of us, especially in terms of our family members, we see what we want, or we see what we always do, or we don't, often don't see them, in terms of any kind of outside perspective or kind of more neutral perspective, because we're just sort of looking at them through this lens of memory and emotion and everything else that we're not particularly observant. We're just sort of seeing what we always do, or to actually see clearly is difficult and often very upsetting, as it is for Sammy in the film, because he realizes what's going on, and this sort of that this sort of emotional affair, or this connection to Benny, is sort of happening before his eyes and always has been. But that's not what he chose to see. And I think that's something that, like, I think is a story that I always respond to and always think is really interesting. And in fact, I noticed that with a couple of, great short films I programmed this year, that it is a kind of common thing, and especially when it's stories about young people. There's a whole kind of subgenre category of films where it's really about seeing your parents and trying and that's and sort of understanding them, or that sort of first flickers of understanding of who they are as people, as opposed to your parents. And that's something that sort of comes up quite a bit. And there's another film that's been very, I think is a very much smaller film, but been very critically acclaimed from the UK, called After Sun, and which is kind of very small scale story of a girl who's maybe 11 or 12 on holiday with her father, who's still quite young, but it becomes clear through the film that the father is dealing with some mental health issues, and there is a fragility about him that the girl sees, and really is just sort of starting to kind of just starting to see who her father is, and what he carries in a way that's really beautiful, and again really kind of empathetic. Like, it isn't like there's this sort of sense that people are being vilified, and certainly that's not the case. And I mean, it's not like, I think that dynamic between Sam and Mitzi and the Fabelmans is really complex, because he does react with anger, but then I think there's that scene where he's made the film, and there's sort of like, I think there's maybe two versions of the film, because he shows a version of the film to the family, and everyone's like, oh hooray, we had this great time at the picnic, this trip. And then there's this outtake reel that he shows his mother, and it's like, hey, here's you, and this is what I saw you with Benny. And he plays that to his mom, and the mom just breaks down completely. Like, she sees it too. Like, I think that his motivation in sort of showing her the film is maybe more of a Jacques kind of moment of kind of like, I caught you.
Yeah.
But she just falls apart. And I think that's a beautifully played scene by the actors, because it's like he doesn't really know what he's messing with. He doesn't really have any clue. He doesn't know what he's sort of bringing about by doing this, and compelling her to see it as well, or compelling her to see it the way he's seen it. And I think that really crushes her. And I think it's a beautiful moment that really kind of it gets to that relationship, and for him to sort of kind of really, I mean, he's not exactly entirely accepting of it, and the movie goes on for another hour and a half, so he's got a lot to process. Yeah. But that act of seeing the parent, and then kind of showing them that you see them too. This is a very sort of profound thing that I think the film gets at really well.
And I find it very interesting, because then he gives up making movies, right? He just abandons it, because something about doing his art has revealed to him truths that he didn't want to see. And I think the film got it very right in that sense, because there's another dilemma of artists, aside from the dilemma that Judd Hirsch posited, which is that, you'll choose your art over your loved ones, and that's going to be a wrench. There's another dilemma, which is art will show you things that you might not want to see, and you have to be willing and able to face these things. And Sammy was not willing and able to face the truth about his mother and her extracurricular emotional affair. And so he abandoned his art, and it was like, no, I don't want to see. And that's very typical of a teenager too, a teenage boy, especially. I don't want to see those things about my mother. Yeah. The only reason I showed her was because she wanted to know why I was so angry. So I said, fine, here, this is why, and it's kind of a, typical teenage kind of behavior. But then he abandons his filming for quite a long time. And he's really having to wrestle with, do I want to make art and see the truth? Because, when you're an artist, it's all about seeing and revealing the truth. And that was his kind of major conflict, I think. I wish in the movie they had made it a little bit more overt, because this was more subtle. So the Judd Hirsch scene was like completely, like you say, text, no subtext. But this was a little bit, I think, too much subtext and not enough text. I wish they had made it just a little bit more overt. I wish we could have seen a little bit more, like maybe a scene with his father saying, "Oh, I see that you've given up film. That's good." And then
Yeah.
Sammy's like, "No, it's not so good," or something like that, to show his ambivalence, to show his, being torn and, wanting, not wanting. And then he just kind of takes it up again. And there's no kind of, you don't really get a sense of the anguish. And I wish we
Mm.
had gotten more of a sense of that. I think that would have been more meaningful, but I think it was important. And I think they did get that right in terms of the way people become ambivalent about their creative process, because when they're faced with a shocking truth that their creative process has revealed, it's like, oh, okay, so this is what it means to be an artist.
Yeah, and I think, and further to that, I mean, that's all really good points too. And I think there's something that it kind of it connects with some of the criticism the film has had, especially when it relates to this sort of next big film that he makes later in the sort of the last film he makes inside the film. But
Yes.
I think there's something else to it which intrigues me, which again maybe is, I mean, I think it's funny because there's things that the film is quite explicit about, but there's other things the film is more implicit about.
Right.
And one I think is, I think Sammy's also freaked out about the power he has in the
Yes.
manipulation of the
Yes.
what I mean. The film, the creativity reveals, there's a revealing of truth, but there's also like a manipulation of things as well. And I think that maybe what you see in the moment with his mother is like, that's like straight up, like he's kind of, I mean, what he's shown her, what he's seen is just crushing and sort of devastating to his mother, and then
Exactly.
by to him. And I think that, but he's also kind of getting more and more experimenting, I mean, through his filmmaking with his Boy Scouts, like about kind of manipulating, kind of the movie magic, the sort of molding of
Yes.
reality to what you want it to be, or just maybe not what you want, but just because you can. And that becomes over with the sort of stuff that happens in the last stretch of the film, where he's in California and he's being bullied at school and is very much the outsider, as the one Jewish kid, or pretty much the one Jewish kid amongst all these like mean, perfect teeth wasp kids who are,
Yeah.
often anti-Semitic, and in that case, he, kind of is enlisted to shoot the kind of big beach day out that the graduating class has, and he makes this movie, and he basically just goes like, turns his sort of chief bully. I mean, he's got a complex relationship with the other teenager, but the other kid is just as devastated as Sam's mom is, to sort of see what Sam has created of him, or based on his image within this film. But it's not the truth. It is like actually the opposite. It's more like Sammy has kind of made him out to be some kind of like Lenny Riefenstahl kind of Aryan god, and the kid freaks out at that. And that's like, wow, like, and that's sort of like that Sam is whether or not, I think there's potentially an interesting thing that I don't think Sammy gets that yet. Like, I think Sammy,
Yeah.
maybe the adult Spielberg understands this, but the teenage Sammy doesn't really know what he's doing yet. He's maybe more instinctive. And I think that's something, like I said, that people have criticized the film of, kind of like, because it is certainly a lot of thoughts about, I mean, certainly anti-Semitism is never far from the news, and this year especially. And then, but that reaction, that sort of like to take this sort of anti-Semitic character and the kind of comeuppance that he gets from Sammy is very complicated. Like, it's certainly not something like, it's sort of easy, like, oh, I'm going to ridicule and expose this kid's racism, and it's like, no, like, he does something very different to the kid, and it messes with his head in a big way. That's a great scene, and I think
Yeah.
that's maybe the most kind of complex operation within the film. And I think it's something that people have been grappling with in the reviews, and just because it's a lot happens in that, and I think some of it
Yeah.
happens without Sammy necessarily knowing what he's doing or what he's intending to
Yeah.
do. So
Absolutely. I totally agree. And when I think about it from the, psychiatric perspective, from people's motivations, this guy was this tall, blonde, athletic, I guess he's the football captain, whatever, the
yeah.
typical jock bully, cheating on his girlfriend, and, just harassing Sammy because he can. And he's got his little friend who's also harassing Sammy, like his kind of sidekick, who's probably harassing Sammy more.
Yeah.
And interestingly, the piece that you didn't mention is that in the film, the camera also follows around the little friend, the sidekick, and shows him to be a total loser. Like at one
Yeah.
point, he's like stealing beers behind two people who are sitting. Another time, he's like taking the beer to a
Yeah.
girl and she's ignoring him. And then he's wandering drunk on the beach. Like he really does to the sidekick what
Yeah.
you think he's going to do to the other one. And
Totally.
then so he splits the two
Yeah.
friends as well. So the one guy he completely denigrates, the other guy he idealizes, he shows
Yeah.
him, and even the guy says, "You showed me as some kind of golden something," like, so, really
Yeah.
golden god, right? So he denigrates the sidekick, he idealizes the athlete, and then at the end, the athlete is freaked out because he says, "I can never be that person that you made me, and everyone's going to expect this of me, and I can't fulfill it. And so you've set me up." And he
Yeah.
cries, and then he says, "You better never, tell anybody that I broke down." And then his friend comes along, the sidekick, and wants to beat the crap out of Sammy
Yeah.
because of the way he was portrayed. And interestingly, the Golden God beats the friend, and the friend scurries away, and so that relationship is ended. So he's
He's
actually broken
destroyed
them
that
apart.
relationship. I know.
Yeah.
I don't think Sammy knows what he's doing. Like, I think that's
No, I
really something.
agree.
Because I think Sammy's reactions throughout that scene, Sam was just kind of bewildered. Like, what?
Yeah.
I don't really. And like, but what he's done this sort of very sort of, most sort of psychologically, sort of tactically brilliant thing that he's actually done, because he's kind of
Yeah.
ruined both these kids
Yeah.
without necessarily understanding how he did it.
Yeah.
Or
And that,
intending to do that to them
yeah.
either.
Yeah. He said the camera just shoots what it sees,
Yeah.
but that was kind of facile. I think you're right. I think as an artist, his instincts, like you were saying, his instincts, his intuition were just following things and just taking it to where the gut was telling him to take it. And his head was not following. So his gut was going, do this, do this, do this. And his
Yeah.
head was like not even catching up until probably like later on in life. But as his instincts were rolling with the film, he was capturing this sort of false idealization of one and this accurate denigration of the other, which would, number one, destroy their friendship, which, divide and conquer. And number two, ruin them both, but in their own particular different ways, so that they couldn't even like come together in the way that they were both ruined. So it's like this brilliant psychological thing that he had no idea, like you said, that he was doing.
And and that's something I think there's really, I mean, certainly thinking about, Jewish American creativity, and I mean, there's a lot of amazing writing and thinking on that very topic in terms of, like, Hollywood, sort of classical era Hollywood, and the sort of construction of these sort of very, kind of waspy ideals that were, engineered by a lot of Jewish American sort of writers and directors and studio bosses, and there is, I mean, there's it's like that. There's something in that scene, I think, that really kind of connects with this wider history of American cinema, and about, how this sort of the Jewish creatives have created these templates for these of very complex reasons. But it's all there, and I think I think that's something that certainly has been talked about a lot about Spielberg, and this is like, I mean, certainly there's been, films that have touched on Jewish themes and stories. Certainly, Munich is a film about the massacre of the Israeli athletes at the Olympics, but this is like by far and away the sort of most Jewish movie that he's made, or most explicitly. And I think that's kind of that connects, because when people start writing about the history of sort of, Jewish creatives in Hollywood, this is a big thing, kind of because they kind of were like, they were erased from a lot of American culture and sort of erased from sort of Hollywood. There were the very little representation of Jewish people on screen, but they kind of created so much of that, which they kind of created a lot of these golden gods that no one could live up to. So I think there's a lot going on there, and I think it's very much, with Spielberg and Kushner are very aware of this too, I think.
Yeah, I thought that scene was really fascinating, because he walked out and he was devastated, and I think he was just confused. I think he looked at his piece of art and he knew he had done it, but he felt kind of alienated or confused. He didn't know what he had done.
Yeah.
And I think that's another kind of very accurate portrayal of a psychological truth about an artist when you've made a piece of art and then you have to figure out what you've actually made, right? Because a lot of times while you're making
Yeah.
it, you're just making it, and then afterwards you sit back and go,
Yeah.
what the heck did I just do, and am I okay with
Yeah.
it, right? And sometimes it's shocking what you've made because you're pulling from something very deep within you, and then you look at it and you're even a little horrified. And I think he was a little horrified, he was a
Yeah.
little shocked, and he was a little confused. So I think that's a really wonderful portrayal of a psychological truth about what it means to be an artist, especially a young artist who's still, catching up with himself, and, his brain is catching up with his instincts.
I think that's very true too. Like, and I think that's something in my experience, like, I've done, many, many, many interviews over the years with people, writers and filmmakers and musicians. And there is this thing that happens, which I find kind of, there's a point where, like, I mean, when people are doing interviews, like, and Spielberg, he's done a gazillion interviews over the years. And so he sort of knows the score, but there's this moment where, like, when a work is too fresh and people have just finished it, they've just finished the movie, they've just finished the book or whatever, and they have no clue what it is anymore. Maybe they don't in the first place, and it just sort of goes into the world, and people start to sort of get different readings of it or sort of understandings of it, and they'll come back to as a journalist, we'll come back to the creator and be like, what about this and this part? And they'll be like, sometimes they'll be like, oh, I didn't see that. And sometimes I've actually had experiences where they were just like upset, like they were like, oh, I didn't, and like, and just because they haven't had any chance to sort of like have any kind of outside
Yeah.
perspective, they've been lost in the weeds in the thing forever,
Yeah.
so they don't know. And
Yeah.
I think that's something that doesn't, like, I think that you do, and maybe you start off with particular ideas about what's going to happen, and then other things emerge in the work that you
Oh,
didn't know
yeah.
about, and
Oh,
are
yeah.
surprising and maybe disturbing to the creators themselves.
Absolutely. And I think, so much of art has to do with, you know, revealing the truth, like I said, but revealing parts of our own self that we don't want to acknowledge or face in our day-to-day life. But as we do our art, those things emerge, that shadow part of ourself emerges. And I think Spielberg, I think the character of Sammy wanted to think of himself as a nice boy,
Yeah.
a nice boy, but he was not a nice boy in this movie, right? he was
No.
he was a very devious, and talking about power, he was wielding his power in quite a, maybe unconscious, but quite deliberate way, with very powerful effects. And this nice boy that he believed himself to be could not be reconciled with what he did with this movie.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point too. Like, I think there's actually a kind of, I mean, there's something unsettling and unattractive about his artistic drive, because he's ultimately, like the Judd Hirsch uncle said, he's going to choose the art over people. He's going to choose art over, he's going to sacrifice relationship. He's going to do that. And because one thing I was thinking about, because I've been thinking about the movie, and there's a, like, interesting choices all the way through, but, like, why does the film end with the scene that it does? Because there's certainly points before where you're like, oh, it's going to end with him and Mitzi, or in with the mother, in with the father, or whatever. But it actually ends with this incredible, quirky, very funny scene in which Sammy meets one of his heroes. I doesn't even know that he just kind of is trying to get a job in the movie business, and he ends up getting this time in the office of the legendary John Ford, the director of some. And there's actually an earth scene echoes, because he's very early in the film. He sees the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and that's obviously
Right.
one of his favorite movies. But this, Ford made that amongst the other many other classic films. And Ford was a notoriously sort of cantankerous, and especially in his later years, he was just kind of a monster. I mean, a brilliant genius. And there's this, and to play John Ford, Spielberg casts another one of the greatest and most influential filmmakers of the last 50 years, which is David Lynch. And and Lynch is actually a really funny performer, and he's
It was
really
it was
hilarious.
amazing. It was
Yeah,
amazing.
and I think the kind of message, I mean, that movie, that is kind of this end note to that theme too. That, I mean, I mean, Spielberg's always had a reputation for being like a really nice guy, and not like
Yeah.
this monster that Ford was, or many other sort of filmmakers of that generation. Like, certainly there's a lot of sort of spurious stuff about Alfred Hitchcock and any number of people who were like these sort of revered filmmakers and auteurs who were beastly people and, quite cruel. I don't think Spielberg's had anything like that reputation, but there is this kind of like, leaves you with John Ford as this kind of like extreme version of the artist, the sort of, the absolutely, kind of selfish and cruel and callous and still very funny and like, but brilliant, and that's sort of like with that scene and you're left with the sort of note of like Sammy, and maybe that's it. Maybe in this alternate universe, the Sammy Fabelman that grows up to be this famous filmmaker, maybe he doesn't become nice guy Spielberg. Maybe he sort of just becomes this sort of monstrous John Ford. I mean, maybe that's sort of that there's certainly that potential. Like, certainly he could go become sort of crazed, Ford, as opposed to, the sort of maybe the nice, thoughtful Spielberg who was making the Fabelmans. I mean, maybe that's like sort of final joke.
Yeah, or to show like that when you're an artist, again, I think he's good at broad strokes and text versus subtext. So maybe the text here was, being an artist reveals your shadow, and being an artist reveals your drive for power and your drive for control. And here is, the epitome of this, in the form of John Ford. And yes, he's a genius, but look how being an artist can, manifest all this darkness, right?
Right, and it's also a bit of a joke too. It's like, well, what has he got for all his amazing films? He's in this office and nobody comes to see him, and he's just like a smoking cigars and being a jerk. No one
having really, lipstick wiped off his face by his secretary after his lunch.
Exactly. He's just a mess. And is that certainly, you could make great art for decades and still end up in this sort of alone and, unhappy. And, I don't think, certainly John Ford is, he had this sort of afterlife and, which was fascinating too, because he really was like a lot of these amazing, incredible directors of the generation. They were just kind of kicking around Hollywood, trading on past glories and having lunch. And, and occasionally it took a while for there to be people like Spielberg or like Peter Bogdanovich, who were these sort of like movie nerd kids who sought them out and just gave them a lot of hero worship at a point where nobody else in the business cared. They weren't getting gigs. I mean, they were just kind of like relics, but then there are all these sort of like that generation of sort of kids who grew up in the 50s who just kind of found these, these kind of withered carcasses and were like, you're a genius, just told them again and again. And they really like that, as you would. So.
Yeah. I think this film psychologically, I don't even know if Spielberg, maybe Kushner, because Kushner I would expect more, but I don't know if Spielberg really even himself at this point in his career really understood how much deep psychology he was infusing in this picture. But there's a lot of very interesting thinking underlying the choices of the characters. The father who is trying so hard to escape this so-called friend, and he keeps moving, and his wife keeps dragging this guy along, and then finally he succeeds in moving, and then she leaves him. The poor guy, he's like, and he never says it out loud, right? He's this nice guy, he doesn't confront, and he just, but he's like so devious himself, right? He's like making sure he gets promoted in order to like get rid of this excess baggage. And he just, poor guy, he fails, right? He just cannot for the life of him, escape until he finally does. And then it, backfires on him. So that's so brilliant, like that it's never spoken about. And you see him struggling so hard to do it. And I love the fact that they never talk about, like that piece. And the mom, this poor woman playing dirges when she leaves Benny, she's playing funeral marches. And again, nobody talks about why she's playing funeral marches. So I love the fact that there's like all this stuff going on that is not spoken about, but it's so true. And then, how, she takes the girls, but leaves the boy with the dad, and then, in California, of course, where he can pursue his career. So Yeah, I think psychologically they got it right, whether they did it on purpose or by accident. Again, as art, that wouldn't be surprising. But yeah, as a film that really, talks about a lot of very deep
Mhm.
personal and emotional and psychological themes, I think they got it right. Whether as a piece of art, it's completely successful. I think it's partially successful, but I think the psychology they totally got right.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to encapsulate it, because I think, it's certainly, as a critic, as a programmer, like, a lot of people think that, oh, it's supposed to be like, film's supposed to be good or not. I'm like, I don't really care if a film is good or not. Like, I kind of just care whether something is interesting. If there is that sort of, it feels like there's questions in the work, or people are trying to process, because I think there's certainly people who would rather see films where things are all kind of settled or neat or whatever. But like, there's just, I mean, I'm sort of always sort of fascinated by whatever I'm watching, is kind of like, what is the artist or the creator or creators trying to figure out? Like,
Yeah.
what's the sort of personal, seed or nut, or what are they trying to get at? And I think that there's a lot that's, going on in Fabelmans. And I've heard, different critiques of it, and some people think it's simplistic or reductive, or but I'm like, no, I mean, because that's the thing, is like I was
Yeah.
saying, like, there's stuff that is very clear and overt and explicit, for
Yeah.
sure. But then there's a lot of other stuff which is,
Yeah. Yeah.
people, I don't think that's good to land on, I think it's Bert, like the Paul Dano father character, who
Yeah.
is, there's stuff going on with him. He's trying to, and he seems like a sort of very, sweet, gentle, somewhat tormented. But there's, and you don't, again, they don't necessarily get those flickers really until quite late in the film, when you're like, where he starts to break down and he starts to really kind of come apart, and you're like, oh, this has been there all along. This sort of maybe kind of sweet suburban, kind of sitcom-y dad, or sort of, that was a facade. I mean, there's all kinds of
Yeah.
facades happening here. That, you
Yeah.
realize people, and again, people unable to see themselves, because that's painful and
Yeah.
disturbing to, a lot of the time.
Yeah. So I think it was a fun film to watch and a very fun film to talk about. I think it's the kind of film that you actually have to like talk about with another film lover
Yeah,
and really chew on, because there's like a lot of material there to chew on. And I think that's what makes a successful film ultimately, when a couple of people can get together and really have a good conversation about it, then it's done its job, right?
for sure. We should do this again.
I would love to. I would
Yeah,
love to.
yeah.
Well, where can people find you, Jason, if they're looking to see, your work, your reviews and your programming and things like that? Where can people find you?
Certainly checking out CinemaScope and Sight and Sound, and their print. I like writing for print magazines, because I like getting magazines in the mail. So
Yeah.
like, I'm very happy to have those. And in the recent issue of winter issue of Broadview, I've got a piece about holiday movies and Hallmark, and
Oh,
Hallmark movies
fun.
and things like that. I was really happy with that piece too. So that's one that's out. And then just please come see short films, and the Kingston Canadian Film Festival in early March in Kingston is also something I'm really excited about. So yeah, I'm around.
That's wonderful. Well, Jason Anderson, thank you so much. This has been really a wonderful pleasure chatting with you today about one of my passions, which is art. And Happy New Year.
You too. Thanks so much.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thank you for listening. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com, where you'll learn about upcoming online events as well. Also, we love getting referrals from our listeners about future podcast guests. So please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com.